Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The book begins with something that's called the Turing test, which is an idea in artificial intelligence that comes from the British mathematician Alan Turing, who in the 1950s, as the computer as we know it was really only in its infancy, was already asking these really philosophical questions. Can these machines actually think? You know, could we someday build a machine that could think? And part of Turing's real insight or real innovation was that he basically put philosophy to the side and said, I'm going to propose a practical experiment. I'm just going to hold a test. And the test is going to work like this. We'll convene a panel of scientists that are going to be having these 5-minute chat conversations. They'll be typing messages into a computer, and messages will be appearing on their screen. But the catch is that what these scientists don't know is whether the messages that they are receiving are coming from a real person who's effectively hidden in a room down the hall, or are coming from a computer program claiming to be a person hidden in a room down the hall. And Turing's famous prediction was that by the year 2000, these computer programs would be fooling human judges about 30% of the time, and that as a result, we would come to think of machines as being intelligent. This is one of the famous predictions of computer science that did not come to pass. It was 2008, though, that turned out to be one of the real watershed years. In 2008's competition, which was held in Reading, the top computer program managed to fool 3 out of a panel of 12 judges, or 25%, which put it just 1 vote shy of Turing's famous 30% mark. So the feeling among many was that humanity had sort of dodged a bullet. And there was the feeling that perhaps 2009's competition, which was to be held in Brighton, could be the year that they finally crossed that mark. And I was determined to see what I could do personally to intercede on behalf of my fellow human beings and make sure that that did not happen. So the beginning of this process for me was getting in touch with the contest's organizer. And so I got in touch with Hugh Loebner and talked with the contest organizers. And before I knew it, my name was on the roster of what are called the Human Confederates. So you have this panel of judges, and they are talking to a number of computer programs and then a number of real people. So I was going to be one of the 4 random representative human beings on the other end of these conversations. And I have to say, it's a bit of a strange feeling to know that you're going to be expected to perform in this sort of paradoxical, high-pressure chit-chat where you have to persuade someone that you're a human being. The programmers that develop software for the Loebner Prize, in some cases, are spending decades fine-tuning their programs. They have a really detailed knowledge of what these conversations look like, what starts to happen, what does it look like when a conversation goes sour and a judge mistakenly starts to believe that a person is a computer and vice versa. And these programs, in many cases, are very deftly able to kind of steer the conversation toward their own strengths and away from their weaknesses. Part of my responsibility was to come to this event ready to give it everything I had, as prepared as I could possibly be. And so this was the big question hanging over me for 6 months of how do you prepare for a competition to be human? And so I found myself not only talking to computer programmers, but also to linguists and psychologists and philosophers. I looked into the history of speed dating because I thought, you know, in some sense, you can imagine the Turing test as a kind of speed date, where you have these two strangers are brought together, plunked down for 5 minutes to have this conversation, and they're both sort of desperately trying to impress on the other person some aspect of their distinct personality. But in many cases, it's not exactly clear how one does that. And so for me, it was this very fascinating journey kind of down the rabbit hole of language and communication.
You describe it kind of quite amusingly as you kind of doing battle against the robots, almost like Terminator or something like that. But also, to a certain extent, what you're taking on is a certain view that we've come to have about what it is to be a human. You were saying, I don't agree with that view. This is a view I more have of what it's more like to be human.
Yeah.
Would you say it's fair? And so what do you think you were doing battle against in that way? And what kind of conclusions do you think you came to?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, in that, you know, when we're talking about the history of humans' relationship to computers, there's a lot more to it than, you know, in these sort of typical sorts of, you know, experiments. Before the 1940s, computers used to be human. Prior to the development of computing machinery, the word computer was a job description. It was someone who did mathematical analysis for a living. And so it's very interesting, in fact, when you go back and you look at those initial papers from the 1940s and 50s, where the founders of the field, like Turing and von Neumann, have to explain to their audience what exactly it is that they're dealing with. There's a paper where Turing says, you know, you can kind of think of this contraption as, well, it's kind of like a computer. And what he means is it's kind of like someone who does math for a living. And so for me, part of what's so fascinating about this story of humans' sense of self in the light of computers is that, as we know, over the past 50 years, the quotation marks have basically migrated. That in the 50s, it was a piece of mechanical gadgetry that was like a computer. But in the 21st century, it is the human math whiz that we say is like a computer. So it's this uncomfortable moment where the literal and the figurative have, in fact, switched places. Part of what I think is the great philosophically fascinating moment that we find ourselves in is that in the 21st century, with the development of AI, we're much less invested in the question of the human being is the only animal that blank. And in fact, we spend much more time thinking about what makes us different from machines rather than what makes us different from our fellow animals. There's actually quite a lot that's going on in something like the Turing test. It's not simply this academic question, but it really ties into our sense of who we are as a species.
We should also say, you know, at this point, you passed the test.
Yes.
But not only passed the test.
Oh, yeah, so I guess I should back up and explain that there are 2 awards given out every year at the Loebner Prize. So the judges are having these conversations without knowing who they're talking to, whether they're talking to a person or the computer. And they assign each of these conversations a score that basically represents how confident they were that they were talking to a person. Every year there is a computer that attains the highest score among all the computer programs that is given the award of the most human computer, which brings its programmer a small research grant. And this is really the award that the test is intended to confer. But there's also this second award, which I think is very intriguing and bizarre, that goes to the real person who has the highest score at the end of the contest, which is the most human award. One of the earliest winners of the most human award was a Wired columnist named Charles Platt. And so he wrote in Wired about his experience. And when asked, you know, what did you do to stand out? His answer is, well, I was moody, irritable, and obnoxious. And both the computers and the other people were very mild-mannered and polite. And so it was clear that you were dealing with a real person. You know, I take Platt's answer to be hilarious and a little bit bleak. But to me, at a deeper level, it's also a call to arms, which is, what does it mean to be human, as human as we can be in the context of a conversation, in the context of this very strange situation of the Turing test, but then what's the relationship between performing well at a Turing test and living well?